And welcome to the March 15th edition of Downtown Orlando UX. This month, we're excited to have JD Jordan with us here, presenting on sharpening your damn axe. And so our mission, as it has been since the very beginning of this meetup, is to create opportunities for anyone to learn and share knowledge about the field of user experience. It's also kind of been a place to help grow the field of UX within Orlando, but our group is much bigger than Orlando now. We've got people calling in from all over Florida and all over the United States. And so we're happy to have you all as part of the group. And whenever we do get back to in-person, we were just talking about when is the next in-person meetup going to be. It'll for sure be a hybrid event so we can keep all of you engaged and a part of our community. So thanks for joining us. And this group would not be possible without our organizer group. I think everybody's here tonight. Is Nick out? I know Abhishek's here, Leah's here, Wes is here. Matt's definitely here. I think Nick may be out, but this is the organizer crew. We love to connect with everybody in the community, so feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. If you have any ideas for the meetup, feedback about the meetup, feel free to reach out and talk to any of us. We'd love to talk to you about future topics or things you'd like to hear from us. And we're happy that you're here. And then with all these virtual meetups, which is over 2 years now since we've been doing these, we've got some housekeeping ground rules. I know it's hard evening meetups after being on Zoom all day long to have cameras on, but it really helps to see people's faces, especially if you have a question. Feel free to go off camera if you don't. But anytime you're talking, it helps to see your face. So please come on camera if you can. And then when it comes to Q&A, JD has told us that he's got some breaks built into his talks for Q&A, but if you have a question, feel free to pop it in the chat or use the raise hand feature. And we'll try to get to you. And as an organizer group, we usually try to keep track of the questions as they come in, so we can make sure they all get answered in the end. So that's it for the housekeeping. And also the picture reminds me, Wes always likes to grab a picture of everybody that's attended. So before we finish with announcements, be sure to hang in there and turn your camera on so we can get a snapshot of everybody that was here tonight. It's always fun to post. And with that, like I said, we've got JD Jordan speaking tonight. So I'm very excited to hear what he has to say about sharpening our axes. And so I'll hand it over to you, JD.
All right, thank you. All right, can everyone see a little dinosaur or a little unicorn? Sorry.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. There we go. All right. Can you guys see a title slide? Awesome. All right. Thank you. All right. So great. Well, thank you everyone for coming out online. As Jason said, I know that after spending all day or some part of the day on Zoom meetings, it can be a lot to come out to a Zoom in the evenings, but I appreciate you guys coming out and for inviting me to talk to you guys about how to sharpen your damn axe. Or I often think of this also as how I learned to stop creating artifacts and actually create and love research deliverables. I got the inspiration for this talk shortly before the pandemic started. Actually, I was at a design conference in Seattle, and I was hanging out relatively alone before the second day of the events. And I was thinking back to, there were a bunch of really inspiring speakers the day before from a bunch of very successful companies talking about design and design practice. And it got me, but most of my career has been spent in agencies, typically on the smaller side, to small and mid-sized agencies or relatively small product teams within a larger organization. And it got me thinking about how most of the design books and most of the literature and conference talks that we encounter take this internal team product focused approach to talking about design process and design research. They present this artifact centric approach, and they present this world where, as I think it was in the description for the event, sort of sarcastically saying oh, we have so much time and so much money and so many people and everyone's committed to design thinking and the customer experience. Let's do everything. And in my experience, that's bullshit. That's not how the project works. So to tee up a little bit about myself, you guys are probably getting a sense that I can be a little irreverent. I hope this doesn't offend anybody. As I said, for about 20, longer than I care to admit, more than 20 years, I've been working in design. When I got started sort of at the end of, or the very beginning of the century, I think every graphic designer, interactive designer was also doing UX, but we didn't really know that it was that at the time. And so I think it was, I don't know, maybe 10 years into my career when a former colleague called and asked me if I wanted to come over to her team as a UXer. And I was like, I don't think I do that. And then she walked me through all the things I already did as an interactive and graphic designer that I just never showed to the client, right? And so, if I show them to the client now, I get to iterate more, and I, as most of us, I hope, enjoy, like, that little bit of a pay bump going from graphic designer to UXer as well. So but I've really gotten very passionate about it. I taught design at Atlanta's General Assembly. I taught the full-time program here for 2 years. I've had my own agency, J&E Creative, for several years, and we were ranked by Clutch at the time as the #1 UX agency in Atlanta, and I'm now the executive design director over at Max Media, which is a 25-year-old mid-sized agency here in Atlanta that recently sort of retooled itself from being mostly a video and content shop to being a custom design and development shop. And so they brought me in from my agency and a bunch of my folks as well. And we now do a bunch of, I think, really great work. If you have a chance, the Max Media website is maxmedia.com. It's in desperate need of an update, but it does a good job, I think, of showcasing some of the work we do. We still do content creation work, but a lot of the work we also do around business intelligence platforms and customer insights platforms and that sort of thing. But enough prologue. Let's talk about your damn axe and you. And so as a designer, like there's clearly a layered metaphor here, right? That as a designer, you have a lot of tools at your disposal, or we have a lot of tools at our disposal. But our axe in this case is representative of our research, right? Our ability to conduct discovery, and our ability to do the job, right? I like to joke with this image that the axe is your research, but the hammer is just a hammer, right? So the metaphor is not global, but because before we can do the job of creating great solutions, whether it be a UI or a flow or whatever it is, we need to sharpen the axe on some good discovery. But as I said before, a lot of the literature out there is about how to do this from a corporate or enterprise level or product shop perspective. And I think whether you're coming from a big product company or you're a freelancer and everything in between, we all would probably agree that research is critical to the process. But for freelancers and small companies and startups, and really almost any agency, and I would argue most consultancies as well, we often don't have the time, money, or the people or the resources that we want to do exhaustive research and to make that part of our process, right? So even when we have clients who are invested in design thinking or really want to transform their customer experience, project-based schedules and budgets don't really give us the flexibility that a product shop might have, right? And especially if it's not immediately relatable to ROI or doesn't, sort of move the project visibly towards an immovable deadline. And so this often creates a pressure that leads agencies and startups to think they can bypass discovery or bypass research and make tragic mistakes. And though it's a few years old, one of the most dramatic sort of product and design errors in judgment that I recall seeing was a company called Shuttle, which if you're not from out west, which I'm not, so I throw no shade, you may not have heard of it, but Shuttle was launched in the San Francisco Bay Area back in, I think it was 2016, and it was meant to be an Uber for children, so that if you need to get your kid across town or from one parent to another or to school or to soccer practice or whatever, you could call a car that would come and pick up your child. And I think that there is a sad and very predictable reason why this doesn't work when you consider both the reputation of the ride sharing services and the protectiveness of most parents, right? Like I have a 16-year-old and I don't know that I'd want her to hop in an Uber at this point, right? So the idea that parents would willfully allow their minor or very minor children in some cases into a stranger's car, it was clearly not researched, and the company collapsed very quickly. And so it's and I'm sure within your own organizations or within your own experience, you could probably think of projects that you're aware of, or maybe that you even participated on, where you hurtled forward without as much information as you would have liked, and at least you know that that there's a gap in the final deliverable because that work wasn't done. So I often harken back to great Abraham Lincoln quote, where he says, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the damn axe." I may have taken a little liberty there for branding's sake, but I think it's true, right? There's actually a fantastic Einstein quote that's very similar about how if he had 6 hours to solve a problem, he'd spend the first 5 thinking about the question or whatever. So it's all about preparing yourself for the work, not just the work itself. And the tendency to rush past research and past discovery is doubly frustrating, as I said, because so much of the literature written about the design process and user and usability research and design thinking is written by internal resources who I would argue are well-intentioned, but also happen to have enough time to write books about design process. While the rest of us have to sort of arm wrestle some of the design process into existence, given our project-based relationships with projects. So we're going to need a little more nimble and discoverable or deliverable-centric approach, I think, to accommodate smaller teams. So going forward tonight, I'd love to continue talking about how we create a space in our process for research, how we make that research actionable and meaningful to our various users and stakeholders, and then how you follow up research with a big old tease of the solution in order to keep things moving forward. And a lot of this is premised on the fact that I think it's incumbent upon designers to make research indispensable and actionable for our teams, and to make sure it's worked into the process, right? Like we have to do it. No one's going to give it to us. So because without doing the research, we're not really validating the problem to determine if we're really designing the right thing, which means we're not really doing the job of design. We're having craft day with our clients' money, right? So it's so yeah, that's sort of what I'd like the agenda to be for the remainder of the discussion. I guess I'll stop at this point real quick to see if there are any questions. I've got 4 or 5 breaks I've built into this. All right. So making time for your damn axe. The purpose of design research, as you guys know, I'm sure, is to validate the presumed problem, right? And to identify any issues that surround that problem, as many of them as you can, to learn what the needs and the pain points and the opportunities associated with users and customers and stakeholders all are, and to get a solid beat on the market, the competitors, and how other creative minds have solved similar problems. Again, a lot of that is true regardless of whatever scale your team might get to operate in. But for smaller teams, freelancers, startups, small agencies, we can't take it for granted that we can skip this, right? We have to make sure we include it. And to include it, I'm talking about things like analytics analysis, competitive and comparative analysis, current state, if you're lucky enough to have one. A lot of startups don't have current states. You might have to swap in something else analogous there. Stakeholder research, which could be an internal stakeholder, could be an external client, could be yourself or a partner if you're in a startup. And then, of course, usability testing and user research. These are all things that we are, all of these that we're all inclined to do. They all have their own catalog of subtasks and artifacts, and all of them take time. Importantly, time that the client typically, or project managers or executives within an organization, might see as delaying the design deliverable itself, right? And this is time that most project-based challenges are hard-pressed to accommodate. So as I said, I used to teach design a lot. For several years, I taught design anyway at General Assembly, also at Creative Circus and SCAD. So I would often, when talking about this sort of problem with students, and I'm sure many of you have had this discussion with peers as well, the inevitable hand up, the question goes, but hey, but wait, can't we just tell the clients and stakeholders that we need more time to do research and discovery, up front? Seems perfectly reasonable, right? But I'll invite you all to say it with Grumpy Cat. No, of course not. Of course you don't get more time, right? Clients and stakeholders think they already know everything they need to know, and that they shouldn't have to pay for us to onboard ourselves, right? But research is not onboarding. we don't do it just to, just to make a book report. We do it to validate the challenge that we've been asked to do and to make sure that we're designing the right thing. So the question then comes, how do we get clients to make more time for research? And I think to answer my own question, the answer is that we don't. We don't get to ask the clients for more time. We have to make the time for it. And so it's with that in mind that I think back to many, many years ago, I read Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it's kind of a cliche business book. I actually didn't read it. I listened to it while driving down to Titusville for a shuttle launch with my 3-year-old, who was awesome at road trips and put up with the book the whole way. But one of the things that leapt out to me, there were 1 or 2 things that really leapt out to me from the book. And one of them was this quote that says, the key is not to prioritize your schedule, but to schedule your priorities, right? So a lot of times we sit down and we look at a project schedule, or maybe we just look at our day or our week, and we have to think about like, oh, well, all these things exist, let's shuffle them around according to, I've got 3 months to do the thing and I've got 10 things to do, so I'm going to shuffle them around. But really the takeaway here is the schedule your priorities. It's don't start with all the things, start with the handful that are most important and figure out where and when those need to happen. And I argue that obviously that research and discovery is key among them. I think it's the most important part of the project. Because it dictates and informs everything that comes afterward. So so we have to schedule that. We have to schedule that priority. So at this point, I'd say let's look at a hypothetical project, hypothetical project schedule, I should say, to see what I mean. So here we are. Here's our timeline from today to the deadline, and we often begin our project simply enough. We have this fixed deadline. We have a sense of the scope. We probably know what the budget is and the hours we have to tie ourselves to, and all the time in the world starting today. And that looks like a lot of design time, whatever the scope is, whatever the span of time is. We've got all this time to work with to create a solution. But clearly, we're UXers, we know the value of testing. And so we're going to have to work in some time in this project to test our concepts, hopefully in a prototype form before we incur any dev debt. And clients are usually very supportive of late stage usability testing because they theoretically understand the need to iterate and resolve any usability issues, but they also really love the validation, of what goes well, right? Of what they've spent money on and time on. So we definitely need to include some usability research. So let's walk back from that deadline a little bit. But okay, so we've got that, but the problem remains, what are we really designing, right? We know we can't just ask clients to push out their deadline to accommodate upfront research. Grubby Cat told us that. So we'll need to take some time off the front of the project in order to accommodate the research that has to happen before design begins. But we also know that our process is iterative, right? If we were an internal team living with a product for months or years, we could perhaps handle architecture and lo-fi wireframing and hi-fi visual design all successively, sprint over sprint over sprint on an ongoing basis. But as a creative partner, as a vendor or an agency working on a project basis, our engagement is time limited and dramatically smaller. So we're going to have to split up our schedule so that we have time to deliver iterative creative, right? So we'll now work in some IA and wire time, and our time to actually execute the solution is getting smaller and smaller, especially because we also need to work in some time for a final presentation and getting everything into Zeppelin and annotated for the devs, right? So all that luxurious design time has eroded at the margins by these necessary steps in the process. And I think as a designer, or as designers, I should say, we're wont to lament this sort of ever shrinking window because that's the fun part, right? Like I would argue both the wires and the visual and the design portion are where we get to move pixel arts around and create usable products and the pretty things that the clients get excited about when they see their project coming to life by you, their badass design professional, right? But I would argue that these time management issues aren't bad things at all. I think we all need to realize that, or we all need to get comfortable with, and I think those of us who have made UX a second career, especially that audience, all of this is design, right? Not just the research, not just the wires, not just the the creation of the solution, but also the presentation at the end, and also the delivery to our peers on the dev side, right? So this whole process is what makes it possible. And that's why we think of ourselves as unicorns, right? Like, this is where the idea of the unicorn as the symbolic animal of the UX professional comes from, because it's the designer that can do everything from new business and project management to research and interviews and wires and flows and visual design and UI and front-end coding probably and prototyping and invoicing. And it's the myth, right? So that person is mythological, just like the unicorn. So and I think the other myth, though, is that we tend to look at a project in toto and say, I need all of this time. And you think you do because you're a beautiful and unique unicorn, right? Like, we all are beautiful and unique unicorns who can do whatever our client asks. But I don't think we are unicorns. I think as creative professionals, a better metaphorical animal for us is that we're goldfish. And the rationale for that is, at least I know in my experience, if you give me 3 months to design a product, I'll navel gaze until the deadline scares me enough, and then I'll deliver something amazing because I'm a professional and I don't miss deadlines. If you give me the same scope of work, but 3 weeks, I will panic and complain, and then I'll deliver something because I'm a professional and I don't miss a deadline, right? So like the goldfish, I am scaling to fit my container. And this is why I personally think that designers working on a sprintly cadence along with their devs, that's a very good way to maintain velocity with designers, because it always keeps the goldfish bowl relatively small, and we can tackle a practical scope of work and without, waiting, kind of farting around for the first month on a 3-month project, not moving things forward as fast as we could. All right, so let me break there and see if there are any questions. I will take silence as you guys think this is going great. All right, but let's talk about how to make our acts actionable. And by that, I mean, how do we take the research and make it a deliverable, not an artifact? And what's the difference between those? So a research as an artifact has its uses. I won't argue that it doesn't. I've been on the receiving end of duffel bags full of raw user data, raw artifacts, and it's very empowering to get all that information. As a designer, I feel like I know what to do with it. I can pivot that data in my head. I can pair it up. I can affinity map it. I can segment it. I can make maps out of it. Do lots of visualization, of course. I really like getting, there's no fault at all in that volume of data, but especially because I'm a designer and I work with a lot of very talented designers. Thinking of research as a deliverable flips that script a little bit, because we have to remember that our users, and I don't mean the end user of whatever the thing is we're working on, but our users, who are the clients and the stakeholders, and I would argue, depending on the organization of your company, potentially C-level folks within your own organization, certainly the dev team, if this is a digital product, that those users, they don't work in the same space we do. They're not going to understand these artifacts. And we're the experts in the design process. They're experts in what they do. So we've got to tailor material for them in a certain way. And so this always reminds me of what I used to teach my students. What's the first rule of design? And it's, you are not the user, right? So you don't want to design something just for yourself. We certainly wouldn't think of telling our client that that's what their final product needs to be, something that's just for me. So we need to think of that too from an internal perspective, from a sort of a project management and how we deliver internally perspective, that we are not the user. We need to think about who those users are. I think an example of this that many of you have probably encountered is if you've ever encountered a client who gets all cross-eyed when you show them a wireframe, right? So we all know what a wireframe is. We understand the value of lo-fi work, but I have encountered so many times clients that will understand a marker board sketch or a back of the napkin sketch perfectly. But once you show them a wireframe, they want to know why the website doesn't have any color and why it's not in English, right? It starts to look too perfect. too digital, and they don't get it. And that's an example of they're not designers, right? They're not familiar with these deliverables unless we, of course, train them up for it. And all of this comes back to knowing your audience, right? Like who our clients and stakeholders and our partners are that are going to be receiving the products of our research, and what do they need from us. Now, as a designer or as designers, I suppose that, the obvious solution is, well, we should do some user research and put together some persona for them. So I present to you 4 persona of the sorts of people that we actually deliver our work to, deliver our products to, that need to make sense of the research. And the first, starting at the top, is the bigwig. This is the executive in a large organization. It could be someone that you never see, or a C-level person who only drops in for an executive review. In a smaller organization, it could be a very hands-on founder of a startup or something like that. But this is the person who has the cigar. It's what C stands for in CEO, I think. This is someone who needs a big picture perspective, right? So they're looking for us to synthesize our research into a way that makes sense for them from a very high altitude view or a very strategic view. They need to know what the tangible results, what the ROI often is going to be on the work we do, at least to the ability that we can anticipate it based on models or historical examples. And they need to know what actionable inputs we need from them. Like, so what is it that they can do for us? What is it that we can do for them? The trouble in dealing with this person, with the bigwig, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, is they tend to not be detail oriented. Again, that they have a big picture perspective. They're not down in the weeds. So we can lose them very easily when we start talking about tactics. They are very mindful of their time and dislike repetition. So we don't want to repeat the same research deliverables over and over again, or we need to synthesize things relatively compactly. And they dislike focusing on problems. These are usually people who are forward-looking. They're trying to make the next quarter better than the last quarter. So they're focused on opportunities. They're willing to write off debt rather than confront the mistake, right? So our opportunities with this audience are what can we present to them that will get them to make decisions to help us move work forward for the user and for the customer? How can we get them excited about what's going to come that we're working on for them? And what can we equip them with in terms of user research so that they've got better talking points, so that they, not just us, can become a good advocate for the user experience. So that's the bigwig. That's sort of your top level. And as we come down a little bit, now we get to probably the most fearful of all clients, the creative client, right? This is the person who thinks they could also do it, or the person who has vision, right? This is someone who is an idea person, that might be a creative director or a design director, or it might be a very savvy, again, like startup founder. This is someone who needs their ideas to be heard and validated by us. So when we're, especially, I know in terms of doing like usability testing, a lot of this type of client will say, oh, I think we should do this. And that may make no sense based on what we know, but it might be something that we should usability test so that they feel heard and we actually can generate some data, right, around their idea. They're looking usually for us as agency partners or freelancers or consultants to be sort of like peers of theirs. They want that friendly rapport. They want us to be flexible, meet when they want to meet, be spontaneous, do a brainstorming session out of the blue when they want to do it. But the pain points, like the C-level person is the idea person, the creative leader tends to also not be detail oriented. They're looking at what's the strategy, what's the big picture of a campaign, or how does this product fit into a larger marketing activity. They also, like a lot of us, carry a fear of rejection. There's sort of a conflation of their personal and professional identities. And they are interested in making sure their ideas are captured and communicated well to us. So that may be in the form of notes, it may be in the form of audio recordings from a Zoom meeting. And so it's important that we get that, because they're going to stress about it. So our opportunities back in delivering research deliverables for the creative person is to, well, for one, the opportunity is to get really generative feedback from them. We're talking to almost anybody else, we can get evaluative feedback. We can find out what users are doing, or what, or what the analytics are, or what's the pro forma or the revenue expectation. But here's someone that has insights that we might get some generative ideas from. So we need to elicit some feedback and some solution ideas from them. And like the executive, we need to equip them with materials so that they can help us move past sort of the politics of process and hierarchy within an organization. But now we get down to, I think, the users that are most often overlooked. We might think of what's necessary. What do we need to present to the C-level? What do we need to present to the design leader? Because those are the people who typically pay our bills. But what do we present to the product owner or the program manager or the senior consultant on the project who's running things on a day-to-day basis? I chose cats on this one because I think that's Jira in its animal form, if you've ever used that one. But this person needs, and again, a lot of designers out there, I'm sure, have felt some of these tensions. That manager needs a harmonious schedule from us. They need us to follow it. They need to trust that we're going to deliver things when we say we're going to deliver them, and they need patience. Because they're not just gonna, if we need something from the client, we need to give them time to do it, right? But the pain points with this sort of person is that they tend to feel like they own the project. Of course, we all tend to feel like we do. They tend to resist, or in my experience, are sort of like loath to embrace confrontation. And they often struggle with the vagueness of what we do. I think one of the great strengths that sort of a design profession and a design career gives us is we become very comfortable with vague requirements, right? Someone, my dev director at work and I were just talking today about, if the prompt was, I need a website, I feel like I can get started, and he doesn't know what to do, right? So a lot of times we as designers, we might be a quarter of the way into the project before we really can define the scope of it. And so, and that's going to be maddening for the project manager. So we have to arm them with details. I think one of the best ways to do this is make them, really inform them about all the steps of the process, so that they know that some of these things might move from a deadline perspective. Some of these things are going to be dependent on the client, and make them sort of a champion for it, because they're the ones who actually get to be the enforcer with everybody. And then the last persona, I think, of the sort of people we deliver for is our collaborators, right? These might be other designers. This is certainly developers, might be people doing a rollout for marketing. It might even be just a third-party usability testing organization, if you have such a thing. So these folks, and I would always argue, by the way, that wherever budget allows, every designer should be involved with the interview process when talking to users. There's nothing that, from an empathy perspective, that really beats being on the phone or the Zoom or in the person with someone and hearing real pain points, hearing real needs, and getting real feedback. Of course, we have to be mindful always of anecdotes and how anecdotes can sway data, but I think that's invaluable. But the truth is that not all of our collaborators can be in the room. And so that's where a well-researched, well-synthesized deliverable can really carry the best information to the folks who are going to have to act on it, right? So we can tell them what needs to be done, what are the objectives. A lot of times, our design colleagues or dev colleagues tend to be passive in that they're waiting for us to tell them what they're to do, or they're waiting for the next tickets in whatever platform you guys use to manage projects, or they're waiting for the next annotation in whatever platform you use to hand off to dev. Like a lot of us probably, there's a high standard for quality, hopefully not all the way to perfectionism, but it happens to the best of us. And so we're going to have that with our collaborators as well. So, but with them, we can validate details of the project. We can validate schedules, the reality of the project. We can equip them with research, so research our deliverables, so they know what to do, and have the sort of a touchstone that they can compare what they're doing back to it. And we can let them get lost in the weeds of what every interaction is going to look like, and whatever, all the annotations that are necessary to get a project delivered. And the truth of the matter is that for all those persona, that most of the research deliverables our users need, we're probably already making, right? So it really becomes how you curate them and filter them for what that particular user needs, so that they can best consume what you're trying to tell them. And I think the biggest delta in that list is, what does the executive need versus what does your collaborator need? Your collaborator needs a lot of detail. The executive needs a 5-minute summary of everything you've done. So there's a dramatically different scale in terms of what you show and how you choose to show it. But across the board, we're talking about showing competitive and comparative work. We're talking about current state, work wherever possible. Data informed persona, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but that's a big deal. Not a creative writing project persona, but one that's got some real data behind it. Maps of the service and the journey variety. Prioritized business and technical requirements. We often actually also include user requirements because it makes the user's needs sound more official. And then of course, stakeholder feedback, user requirements, as I said, but also that inclusive of that is also user feedback in general. My team has over the last several years developed sort of a repeatable process for all this. And I know this is too small to see, but I like this diagram because I feel like it challenges the New York subway poster to some degree. But what we're trying to show is that there are several steps that we can share this with our project managers, for instance, and say, right now we're in the first column, the evaluation period, where we're doing the current state and the competitive and comparative analysis. And then the current state's covering a wide gamut of things from looking at content and usability and branding and whatever. And then we go into an inquiry phase where we're talking to stakeholders, we're talking to users. And if we have something to usability test early on, like a current state product, we'll usability test it there. And then we will process all that information using task analysis, using affinity mapping, whatever the appropriate activity is to make sense of the data in the first two columns. And then when we get to the fourth column, that's where the action is, right? This is where we produce persona and journey maps and requirements and KPIs and all the official deliverables of a research phase of work, which we then present sort of as our rationale for where we are and how we want to move forward. The last two columns, the visualization and recommendation, I'll talk about those in a minute, but let's start first by talking about these sort of first five columns. And this is the point when I've done this talk before. This is the point in the talk where I show lots of stuff that I'm probably not supposed to. That is, I think it's infinitely more valuable to show real work than to just show pretty slides, as much as I like making pretty slides. So for the purposes of tonight's presentation, I'm going to be showing some content that comes out of a recent project Max Media has been doing with a very large logistics company. I'm sure, as many of you know, while the pandemic's been going on and a lot of markets have been shrinking, logistics has gone through the roof. And so we in this case have a logistics company that's a client of ours that through acquisition and organic growth ended up with about 14 or 18 different brands and different websites out in the world. And a lot of them were multiple brands for the same service. But this is a freight company that really has 5 or 6 distinct lines of business, and within those lots of variations, and they need all of that consolidated. So we did a lot of research, and what you're seeing here is the title slide from where we consolidated all that together to give a high-level overview of the research that we've done and to give some actionable deliverables that their designers could start using right away and that their leadership could use to sort of keep other initiatives going that tied into ours. So one example of an actionable deliverable, I think, is a competitive analysis, which in this case, we've limited ourselves to just looking at 8 distinct competitors. We've identified 4 that are sort of the ones that are most important. We actually looked at quite a lot more. We're really, at this point, as I said, you got to know your audience. So we're really just trying to give a snapshot, not a full book report of what we've done. And I think one of the things that we need to be mindful of whenever we do competitive work or competitive analyses of any kind is we need to focus on not just showing a list of all the competitors we talk to and all the great things they're doing, unless we're also prepared to say, what is our opportunity in response to that? So in this case, one of the competitors, if they're really good, or if they have really competitive rates, right? We're not going to be able to beat that rate, but that's their differentiator. They're the cheapest one per mile. How do we respond to that, right? And so we have to tee up to the client, well, this is how you respond to it. Like, no, you're not the cheapest, but you have the lowest incidence rate. So what they're paying for is the security of and the safety of their shipment, which is in fact the case with this client. So so we always need to make sure we have an answer to whatever the challenge we're saying exists out there. I think it's also important that we provide sort of the bona fides for a lot of our work. So if we're getting into user-based work, like I'm about to show you a persona, when we presented this work, we preceded it by letting them know, like, this is not us making up what a small and medium business person or an enterprise customer looks like, that this is based on interviewing a large sample of customers and an even larger sample of stakeholders. And I'll explain why the stakeholder count is so high in this particular case. But because they need to understand that one of the misconceptions I think that lingers in design, even though it's a little easier in UX than elsewhere, but in all design activities, is the notion that what we're doing is subjective. And what we're doing should not be subjective. And so we have to remind folks that no, there is data that informs the decisions that that informs the solutions that I'm going to present to you. So in this case, we developed a number of very tactical personae for them based on those interviews, based on desk research. And I really do stress, or I have stressed with students in the past and with my team, if you don't have data to back up something, then that does not get into the persona, right? So I have definitely worked at large enterprise companies where they had these sort of stereotypically bad persona of, oh, it's a single mom of three who makes this much a year and for some reason has an iPhone and all these streaming service subscriptions. And it's like, this is all just made up. This is just, again, I like to think it's a creative writing exercise. You are fabricating sort of a fictional character. So that the persona need to be based on real data, and they need to be created or segmented in such a way that targets what the purpose of the project is or what sort of the aim of the business might be. And I think that unless you've prioritized, not just segmented the persona, and by prioritize, I mean I literally mean like for our project, which persona is the most important, or how would I rank them in terms of importance? And if I can connect them to needs and pain points and opportunities that I'm going to directly address with the solution, then persona can be confusing. But rather I say that those are the things we need to target them at, because these are going to be one of the best tools to sort of show how what we're doing down the road directly answers a real user complaint. Another thing that I think we need to be careful of, especially in current state analysis, is we're telling them, usually because they know that things need to be changed. We just have to make sure that we never ever mistake the invitation to critique for an opportunity to call the baby ugly, right? Even if we think we know what our client's role was in their current branding, in their current website, in their current app, they're still invested in it in a way we're not. So we have to be careful and mindful of how we present critiqued any product, especially if we're wanting to make changes to it. And again, I was talking before about how you've got the difference between levels of detail. I've got the two slides I'll close on this part are about a customer journey map. This is why we talked to 51 stakeholders at this organization. They're going through a digital transformation over there. And so a lot of what we did was look at how do customers engage with you now? How do you currently convert customers at the moment? And what should you be doing instead? And so the journey map that we're looking at here is what and it's not meant to be legible at this distance, of course, just to show the scope of it. Is to show like, here's all the touch points end to end of the user journey and all the things you need to do to improve that journey, to improve the customer experience. And for our collaborators, and I would argue at the managers as well, but for our collaborators, the level of detail on this diagram is very valuable. And we printed this on a plotter all huge and stuff, and we were happy to see that several of the stakeholders have it hung on the wall in their office. So it literally is a roadmap for where we're going. It is not digestible by PowerPoint, and it is not appropriate for an executive summary. So we might take that same information and bust it out this way, right? So that we can show that, yes, in that long, elaborate journey map, you really have these five, you have these 5 phases, and within these 5 phases, there are 6 subcategories, but we have these 5 phases in the life cycle of the customer journey, and they're roughly organized by when the customer has decisions to make. And then, of course, we have to reassure them, because this is a very operationally minded company. Their quarterly returns is completely based on their freight margin, so that we make sure we remind them everything you're looking at, we've been looking at through a lens of ROI. We're not suggesting that you rebrand every truck tomorrow, because that would cost a fortune. But maybe as you acquire new trucks, you can roll them out with the new branding, and we'll do it organically to save money. And that is the folks who are the C-level folks, the folks who are very money receptive, especially in a public corporation, need to hear that from us, right? It helps sort of, just like what we do isn't subjective, we also need to show that we're mindful of the bottom line. All right, so questions there before I move on to the next step? All right, so now that we've shown, so now that we've tailored how we present our research deliverables, and I want to make sure we never lie, we never like make anything up, right? What we're doing is we're really empowering our clients to do their jobs with our research, and they can start doing it right away, right? With some of these deliverables. But it's really just the tip of the iceberg. And so here I want to take a quick break and remind everyone that it's not just enough to have a sharp axe, but our axe needs to be sexy as hell, right? Or sexy as fuck. And what I mean by that is that freelancers and startups and small agencies, and in many cases, some internal teams as well, are always selling, right? And the best way we can sell ourselves is, of course, with what we're doing on a day-to-day basis as part of the process, right? And I think there are two things any designer should be doing to sell the value of their research. They're really easy. They're super simple. They are both very time consuming. But that's okay, because if you think back to our schedule on the wall, we built in plenty of time for different steps of stuff. So the first one is just simply that our research needs to look good. And I kind of can't stress this enough, right? So it's like someone hired us to be their designer or their design professional, and their reputation, at least for the duration of the project, is associated with us, right? So every single thing we send to them or show them needs to look like it comes from a design professional. Everything, like invoices, email signatures, like everything needs to look good. It can't all just be slapped onto a Miro board. There's got to be some format to it, right? And because we have no control over who sees these deliverables once we send them out, right? Once they go out into the world, they might get distributed within an organization. And if it looks like shit and has your logo on the corner, that's a first impression made, right? So you don't know how it's going to be used, and opinions are going to be formed about you without you present looking at these deliverables, right? So we have to make sure we make time to polish our research, put it into a nice report that's something that they can socialize, that's going to represent us well when they do socialize, and that exceeds their expectations. After all, we spent weeks, right? Let's assume we had the 3-month scenario, not the 3-week scenario. We spent weeks doing research, so we need to make sure it's up, that the quality of the presentation matches the quality of the work. And so things we can do, I think, to get there are, if you're doing this in Keynote, or if you're doing this in Sketch, or wherever you're laying it out, use the same sort of orderly grids and typographic rules you would use for real client work, for the final product, right? So, have just a couple complementary type treatments, put it on a grid, use unsplash photography without watermarks if you need photography, but don't put something that's got a big Adobe in the middle of it. Make sure the icons make sense. There's no excuse for bad iconography these days, and proofread it. I'm sure I keep thinking of intentionally putting a typo on this slide, but because I'm terrible with typos, but have someone in the project, especially someone who doesn't know the project well, proofread it if you can. And then the second thing that we need to do is back up the research with inspired recommendations. And this is something that I don't see a lot of agencies do. So like when we do our research and strategy phase of work at Max Media, we typically will do it over the course of, let's say, 4 sprints, right? And the first 6 will be up what I've shown you already. That's the research and the analysis and the synthesis and the presentation. And then we save the last one for where do we go from here, right? Because the client needs to see it. They're not necessarily going to imagine it themselves, right? So we can't necessarily assume they're going to execute on the design unless we tell them how, right? A lot of, I've seen work from very prestigious agencies that does a great job of talking about a strategy, right? We need to make more money. We need to sell more widgets, but they don't tell you how to do it. And that's, I think, where we as if we think of UX as a strategic activity and not just a visual one or a procedural one, then we're in a unique place to say, if this is the strategy, here are the 10 things you need to do to get there. And so we need to show that to the folks, especially to the folks who sign checks, right? And so I often like to start these conversations with some sort of framing narrative. In this case, as I mentioned, we're dealing with a company that is consolidating a number of parties, but they've also been around for a very long time. They used to only have one service, and then they've expanded to a wide variety of services and a wide variety of child companies that they've through acquisition. And what we're doing at this point is we're consolidating all that without throwing away where they were. Like, so this conversation right here is for the creative and for the bigwig, right? This is a big picture of, this is our vision for how we're going to talk about this sort of thing. And even down to the point of, and here's sort of the unique marketing speak sort of selling position here. Here's some things we are, here's some things we're not. This is setting up, like, we're now framing the work that's going to come after, the more detail-oriented work. And when I talk about the detail-oriented stuff, I'm not actually talking about going ahead and giving them everything. I think we need to think of our friends Kate and Leo. I just showed my kids this movie, so that's why they're top of mind. And their friend, the iceberg, right? Because really the opportunity here is to show our stakeholders and our clients just a little bit of what they can do with the insights we've given them and that we've prepared for them. And then they can imagine what to do, go from there, right? So if 10% of the iceberg is above the water, that's all that we're showing. Another way my team and I have talked about it before is, it's like when you see a building from across the skyline, right? There's, it's 10 blocks away and you see a building. Well, you don't see all the detail in that building, but you have a good sense of the building itself. And that's another way to think of it, right? We're not getting into all the micro interactions, all the fine points yet. We're trying to suggest where do you go from here? And the two deliverables we try to tee up here is, one is, we call it the gap, and the other one is called the menu. And so the gap is where you remind them, kind of like that sort of framing narrative device I had a second ago. The gap is where it's the really important recommendation that we usually present it immediately after the research. We don't want to bother holding punches. We want to get paid and show the client that the money is well spent, right? So here's what we're saying. Here is the precise exact thing you need to do. Here is the precise goal that we are striving for, in this case, presented as a user story. And then also backed up with, if you remember that big journey map, 6 very precise, very tactical points that we are going to dive in on to deliver on the strategy they want of converting more of a particular type of customer. Right. So, and by connecting the vision, the recommendation, so closely rhetorically to the research deliverable, like maybe just a sprint later, sometimes we do this in the same document, you create a causal association that says we're doing this because of that. And that really helps combat the subjective bias held against a lot of designers. It's basically us saying that because we did this thorough research and we gave you these really well synthesized, clearly presented things, that's how you also know that this is the most important recommendation that we can offer you. And then, we get to be the heroes. We then usually go into what I was calling the menu. And this is where we quite literally just show them, often like one item per slide, and all the recommendations, and you should do this, and you should do this, and you should do this. We're not designing full solutions. Again, we're just showing you maybe a hint of what's to come, right? And all of these, and all of them with some visualization. We have to, yes, we might include some rationale in text, but really we're talking through it more at this point. In this case, we're saying that for customers who are trying to identify their freight and shipping needs, we're going to provide them with thought leadership. We're going to provide them with social media content. We might also show them something that really transforms or creates a new experience that doesn't exist currently. Like, they currently don't have a customer onboarding experience online. So that's something that we pitched for them. And the idea for that is to get the client excited about where they're going. Is because now it's not just a list of requirements in a document that meets the needs of a nicely illustrated persona, but it's something visual that they can show their boss, or that they can keep in their mind and trigger their imagination for how these opportunities we've identified are going to be executed. we sometimes will even take this opportunity to go far afield outside of what we've been asked to do, right? So if we're dealing with a revenue generating website, that does not necessarily mean we need to think about an onboarding kit that would be physically mailed to people. But this is something that came up in our research. And so we would be remiss not to show it, right? And of course, you never know, they might go for it, right? So if we think it's a good recommendation, we include it. But you might ask, and I feel very passionately about this part, but you might ask, JD, this is spec work, and spec work is shit. Like, we're not supposed to do spec work. It's bad for business. It's bad for the profession. Don't do it. And I would argue this is not spec work, right? Spec work is done for free. This is work that the client paid us to do. We are including what to do with the research within the scope of the project, right? So it's our research and our recommendations. We've been paid for them. And this is just a phase of that process, right? Of that research process. Because if we don't show them what they can do with the information we found, then we aren't really delivering on all the possible opportunities from the research we did. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? We're just doing this to connect research to what the tangible next steps are so that we can generate enthusiasm for the solution, so we can keep things moving forward. We can't just, and like I said, for our bigwig, our C-level people and our creative leaders, they can take this and they can use this to get funding, and they can use this to move things forward within their organizations. And it can be a damn sexy act. People get so excited about this stuff when we show it to them. And yes, everything here is a lot of work, right? Like, I don't think any of us got into this profession because it was easy, right? Or because it didn't, fill our time. But so no doubt about that. And it may be a mind shift difference in terms of how you do work currently. But I can say I've been a freelancer. I've had 2 agencies. I've worked with lots of startups. I've worked at mid-sized companies. This process does work. It is effective as a communication tool and as a sales tool, first foremost as a communication tool. And I think there's a really interesting side effect of pivoting away from creating artifacts, which might only mean something to us, to deliverables, which means something to an audience. And it's one I hadn't realized until we've done this quite a lot of times, but when you synthesize your deliverables this way, it's really analogous to an accessibility solution, because what you're doing is, by making it more understandable to a wider audience of people, you are expanding the reach of your research and your design recommendations, right? And more people within the organization are going to understand it, because it's not going to be couched in perhaps a visual style or a linguistic style that's really isolates it within our profession, right? So I really do think that if you create these deliverables this way, it's an accessibility win. And I think too that those of us who really get into research process, especially in terms of how it connects to solutions, I really think that we need to make sure we bring it out of the workplace too, right? In the same way that I think the exercise of professional empathy for our users engenders in the creative a genuine empathy that goes with them throughout their lives. I think if we take this design process into outside of the workplace into our daily lives, we can improve things dramatically elsewhere as well. And that sharp axe can kind of go with us everywhere. Because most of us, I think, we will get more out of life if we take that sort of design thinking approach to things with us when we leave the office. I like to joke that, and my wife and I, she was my business partner in the last agency I had, we talk a lot about how we've UX'd our children a number of times, right? One example I like to give is in terms of how we've UX'd our life is when they were littler, they kept leaving Legos all over the floor, which anyone who has children knows that it's one of the most painful experiences, especially in the middle of the night, to barefoot step on a Lego. And so we interviewed our kids and elicited feedback from them to determine what the appropriate solution was other than yelling at them, and ultimately found one that made everyone very happy. And and we've done this in terms of creating our own business. We've done this in terms of creating family vacations, and it's been very effective. So I think what we do and how we do it at work can go with us anywhere. And I know I talk fast, so I appreciate everyone listening. But I'm down for questions if anyone has any questions here, because I think you guys have been really patient and listened to me for a whole hour.
I believe the only question we have from the chat so far is Wes's, so I'll let him jump in.
Hey JD, thanks for that. That was amazing. A few slides back, you were talking about the research process, and you kind of showed all of the steps, and there were some tracks there. And is there a timeline that you have associated with each of those swim lanes, or do they vary? I guess it would be great to talk a little bit about like what you can be expecting to invest here in time.
Yeah. I think it varies, of course, based on the team and the experience of the people involved, and of course the scope of the project. My team at Max Media, it's relatively, we're not a huge team. There's 8 of us or so, but we will typically take on a good-sized project and do this research phase in 8 weeks. Do it in 4 sprints, and we'll usually try to focus the first sprint as much as possible on all the current state and lining up all the stakeholders and users, which is often the most time-consuming part of the project, right? Is getting those folks. And then we will pile on in the second sprint in terms of knocking those interviews out. We usually try to have 2 people on every interview, so someone's free to not take notes and remain actively engaged with the customer or the user. And that's really often a very good place for the non-designers to get involved. So the way we do it is a designer always leads the interview, but we might have a project manager or developer taking notes so that they're also hearing user feedback. And then really in the third sprint, we focus on synthesizing all that into something that we can use and the client can use. And then in the fourth sprint, teeing up what might come next. Our visual team will often actually get involved in the third sprint. They've started before the fourth sprint, especially if there's we've got 2 projects right now going in parallel with each other. They're also both logistics projects, and they also both include rebranding in addition to all the normal, usability and UI concerns. So we started talking branding day 1, even though that's theoretically not something that we would deliver until the end of sprint 4.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
JD, I've been thinking about this from kind of the in-house perspective, coming from client services background and then going in-house and being in-house for a decade or more now. I feel like a lot of this is very applicable in-house too. And I feel like the process is never an ideal world process, even in-house. So I'm curious how much this process varies, like how much the menu changes from client to client that you talked about, the gap in the menu. Is it always custom tailored, or are you able to take enough of the process and iterate on it that you feel like you have a pattern from client to client?
Yeah, I think it's more of a pattern, or we often describe it as a toolbox, because so again, I mentioned that I've got 2 projects that are at this, we're finishing the first sprint on both of them right now. One of them had a current state platform we could review. The other one is totally brand new. There's nothing. So there's our initial steps in the process are very different because there's no current state to look at from a visual or content or usability perspective, right? So that puts a little more pressure on the competitive analysis to really dive in and make sure we know where the gap is in the market. It also means we're not going to have any users to talk to. We have some potential users, people who fit a profile. But so the reality of which steps we deploy are going to be different every time. And they'll even be different in terms of is our internal dev team going to be the team building it, or is your client side dev team going to be the one building it? That very much changes how we end up pursuing some of these things as well, because in that case, in the latter case, we probably don't have to elicit technical requirements. You have probably given them to us. We may make recommendations or suggestions based on what the user said, but if it's our team that's involved, that's going to be doing the dev, then those questions are all going to be a part of this process as well. So it's more of a roadmap rather than a, you have to hit every exact step. We're going to get off on some exits earlier or later, or not take them at all. But we like to call it a repeatable process, because it prompts us to ask ourselves every time, oh, well, do I have anything to usability test out of the door? Do I need to make a journey map for this? Do I need to codify user stories and stuff like that? So it just sort of reminds us, like a checklist, to make sure we're hitting all the points.
Wes demonstrating the raise hand feature in Zoom. Go for it.
I'm using it. And I'm glad you kept it on the slide, because it ties into what you're talking about, right? Like how does your team, or are there methods to help decide which of these approaches to take as you're kind of synthing through all of these techniques? It's a great toolbox,
Yeah, and it's actually, it's proven to be very helpful for us from an estimating perspective as well, because that's an activity that often has non-designers involved. So for them to say, oh, and I don't have the number off the top of my head, I should, but it's like, oh, if there are 23 steps in our sort of research and strategy normal scope of work, like how much time needs to be allocated and how many resources need to be allocated for each one. These are questions estimating is hard for anybody. I was talking about how, like, we embrace vagueness in what we do. It's super hard when it's really vague, right? But really it comes down to what can we determine ahead of time, what can the client provide us? We often ask for homework, for instance, like provide us all your analytics, provide us a list of users, provide us a RASI list of stakeholders, stuff like that. So we can use that to start scaling out the first 2 or 3 columns here. The truth is, it's really hard to, as you move from left to right across this diagram, each stage becomes increasingly difficult to anticipate, right? Because we might go into this thinking we don't need a journey map, and then realize that we really do. And then the scale of what the recommendation at the end is going to change based on information we elicit from users or information we get from stakeholders, in the third sprint. So we have to be very flexible with it. But like agencies, we're usually on a budget and we're usually on a deadline. So this is where the tension with the manager can come from, in terms of making sure they're really an ally and understand all this. Because if the scale of the visualization rockets up, it's going to blow us out of budget. So that's where a change order might come in, or that may be where we make the call to scale stuff back, and talk about a phased approach, which is everyone's favorite thing nowadays. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, it does. And I think about, like, looking at each of these, you all get really good at it. I'm sure that's what you get paid to do, and people hire you to do it. Do you have pieces of this that are pretty well operationalized, and you're able to, like, use them from a small group within your team's process, and you're like, okay, we know how to do this. We're going to be able to just, wash, rinse, repeat on each client, even though each client is very unique?
Yeah, I think so. I think especially in the very first stage, the current state and competitive, that we've got templates for this. We've got there's sort of though it changes, like I said, right now we've got one that's where we're including an analysis of branding assets. I think user experience is sort of the core of the brand experience these days. So, they're looking for recommendations there, and that's not something that we always do. But we haven't gotten so far yet as to create our own Miro templates. But we do have sort of a standard presentation format at this point, sort of when we go in and we show all the when we show all our research deliverables, and we have a standard format for that, so that folks can very quickly throw their stuff in, capture their feedback, because our presentation doubles as the printable deliverable. We want to make sure it's all written in there. So, but I think it's, we kind of employ sort of a lean UX perspective, where it's document as you go, and then you've got what you need at the end. And we don't worry about recording an artifact every step of the way. Like, we do things like record all the conversations, we keep all the post-its and Miro and stuff like that, but but we only present the synthesis.
Awesome, thanks.
Looks like Tink has a question.
Yes, hi. I think my video's on. I'm sorry, my room's dark and I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I was wondering, because there's a lot going on in this process, obviously. Do you have any guidelines or insights on how to scale it down if you're working like as an individual designer or on like a 2-person team?
Yeah. No, totally. Because I think, let me, yeah, I think you can certainly simplify it down to just like there are a handful of things that we should do really in almost every project. And sometimes based on that project, one of these activities might take 30 minutes, right? But it's to sort of make ourselves sit down. Like the one that's often the fastest one for us is the comparative analysis. So we may have spent several days really getting into who a lot of the competitors are, learning a lot about them. An example that comes to mind real quick, that's not from the freight example, but from we were designing a yoga sequence builder for a company. And as we got into talking to users, it was just sort of like a little click for the two of us involved with the project. We were trying to think of, well, what else is like this? And one person was like, oh, well, like iMovie is like this. And the other person was like, D&D Beyond is like this. And so we very quickly were able to get to some comparative examples of what we were looking for. That process went very fast, right? So but a lot of, in terms of how do you limit it as a freelancer, I think in my experience comes from setting sort of your own limit on it. For instance, if you're in a sufficiently advanced market, like freight or something like that, where there are hundreds of companies, your competitive analysis could go forever. So rather you have to limit yourself and say, like, I'm going to look at, 8 or 12 of the biggest or closest competitors, maybe an aspirational competitor or two. And I'm going to have a rationale for how I pick them. It's not just going to be darts at a board, but because you can very easily spin out and waste too much time on that. So, but none of these activities, probably with the exception of actually talking to humans in user interviews and stuff like that, a lot of these activities can be compressed to accommodate a small scope of work, I think. Sadly, you can't speed up talking to somebody. The interview always remains, the longest hour of your day, maybe 4 times a day. Right.
Or at
Awesome,
about
I appreciate it.
We're at about 8:47 Eastern, and so we probably don't have time for many more questions, but Ariel Medina asked in the chat how you prepare for UX research interviews.
Research on what?
UX research interviews. How you prepare to talk to users.
Yeah, so a lot of it is we typically talk in terms of like the order of who we're interviewing. Of course, we've talked to stakeholders in the lead up to actually starting work. And this would be true if we were in-house or agency, whatever, right? So you've got some stakeholder involved that's giving you some information. We've now done some of that desk research, looking at the website, looking at the competitors, educating ourselves before we talk to users. But we will typically conduct a whole round of stakeholder interviews first. Now, they're not more important, but they know their industry better than anyone else. And we can learn the business objectives. And then we often kind of sketch out, we often ask folks when we do user interviews for 45 minutes, and then we book an hour, right? But you aim to actually talk to them for 45 minutes. And once you write down a handful of questions, evaluative questions, right? Not ones about expectation. My favorite example for this is if like for instance, that yoga therapy app, we didn't ask people, how often do you plan to go to the gym next week? Because they would say 3 times. And rather you ask them, how many times did you go to the gym last week? And they're like, once, right? But that's honest. That's not, that's not an aspirational behavior. It's an actual evaluative question. So we usually come up with as many questions as are relevant to the project. A lot of times it's things like, Talk to me about, how you use the current platform, what device you're using it on, what's the environment you're using it in, what are you trying to get out of it? Where is your role going in the next few, where do you see it going in the next few years? Where do you see your company going in the next few years as the customer maybe using the thing? But often the first 1 or 2 interviews kind of are a draft interview, right? So you're still going to get great data out of it, but I often go into that first interview with way more questions than I reasonably can ask in 45 minutes, because they're going to take you in the direction of the conversation, and you just need to have the questions ready to go to follow them, right? You got to follow the user. You can ask all the leading questions in the world and follow them where they go. So but you totally, like, I don't believe that once you lock in the questions, you can't change them. Of course, we're not operating in an academic environment, so we can be a little freer about that sort of thing. But I've almost never encountered a situation where we didn't, after the first interview or 2, go back and say, like, well, we got to change some of this because something the stakeholder represented to us does not match the reality, right? Or there's a situation we didn't know about, right? Because we're process guys, not industry guys. So but again, that comes down to being really flexible about it. And I will say that my entire team, we did a variety of personality profile tests a few years ago. We did the Myers-Briggs and the DISC and the Enneagram and the Hogwarts sorting hat, and to try to get a sense of where we all fit. And we found that not one of us is an extrovert. So but a bunch of us are professionally extroverts, right? So it's, tonight after we log off, I'm going to go in the other room probably and watch Dune and not talk to anybody, right? But my kids will be asleep. But but during the day, I talk to users all the time. I talk to stakeholders all the time. And so it's it's just sort of like it's a professional activity, just like anything else.
We got lots of thank yous and comments about such a great damn talk this was, JD. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming tonight and sharing your wisdom. I hope everybody just give a round of applause virtually or come off mute and help with that. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.